Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. In the emergency room, you expect to see pain, blood, panic. But not everything that walks in is alive. Nurses talk about patients who vanish before intake, figures standing at the ends of beds no one is assigned to, and calls for help coming from behind locked morgue doors. Some things enter the ER that no chart can explain. I had already spent more nights than I could count walking the fluorescent-lit corridors of Sacramento General's emergency wing by the time that particular incident occurred. And while I was no stranger to trauma, to death, to the slow erosion of emotion that comes with repetition and overexposure to human suffering, I can say without hesitation that nothing in my years of service, no accident, no code blue, no shattered family in the waiting room, ever prepared me for what we encountered on that quiet, low-pressure September night in 2001, long after the chaos from the warehouse fire downtown had been reduced to charting, cleanup, and quiet. The body had come in around 11:15 p.m., wheeled in by paramedics who looked far more shaken than they usually did, though neither of them said much during the transfer beyond a few curt confirmations of time, location, and the grim details of what was believed to be a fatal inhalation burn case sustained during a structural collapse at a condemned freight storage facility on the south edge of the city. One of those places long overdue for demolition, but somehow still standing, waiting for tragedy to give the budget committee an excuse to sign off on its removal. The man, if you could still call him that, had been pronounced dead on site, a presumed victim of third-degree thermal trauma and asphyxiation. And though he bore no identification, no family information, and no immediate claim, his arrival was logged as standard protocol dictated, and he was zipped tightly into a regulation black vinyl body bag with the toe tag reading only M unknown, and a presumed time of death noted as 22:54. I was on shift with Kara that night, a competent and capable ER nurse whose practical demeanor and emotionally reserved nature made her the kind of colleague you trusted in high-pressure scenarios. Not because she smiled or comforted you, but because you knew she wouldn't crack under pressure and would get the job done no matter how unpleasant it was. Together, we pushed the gurney down the elevator and through the sterile, humming corridor that led to the morgue's cold storage, where the heavy chill in the air always smelled faintly of bleach, rubber, and something deeper and more permanent, something I've never been able to fully describe, but have always associated with the kind of cold that doesn't just linger in the air, but soaks into your skin and settles into your bones. The bag was still warm when I touched it, and while it wasn't unusual for residual heat to remain in a sealed transport after exposure to fire, there was something unnatural about the way that heat radiated, not as though it were merely retained, but as if something inside was still generating it, still pulsing beneath the vinyl like a cooling engine that hadn't quite finished shutting down. We said nothing as we aligned the gurney with the open drawer, and just as I reached down to guide the wheels into place, there came a sound, so sudden, so sharp, and so out of place in that cold, tiled room that I stopped mid-motion, unsure whether it had been a mechanical groan or a trick of the air vents shifting above us. I looked at Kara, and she looked back at me with an expression that, while unreadable at first glance, held a tightness around the eyes and mouth that told me she had heard it too, and was waiting to see if it would happen again before speaking it aloud. as if naming the sound might make it real in a way we weren't ready to accept. Then it came again, and this time there was no doubt. No creaking drawer, no shifting compressor, no plausible mechanical failure could have produced that long, high-pitched, and unmistakably human sound that curled upward from the sealed bag like steam escaping from a kettle, but laced with panic, agony, and a desperation so raw that it turned my stomach to ice. There was no discussion, no exchanged glances, just an unspoken agreement between us as we reached for the zipper, our fingers moving clumsily with the kind of instinctive hesitation reserved for only the most horrific possibilities. And when we finally pulled it open, the smell that rose up was thick, chemical, and suffocating. Not just the expected combination of charred skin and smoke-soaked clothing, but something more acrid and unnatural, like scorched wires and hot metal soaked in ammonia. What lay inside the bag could barely be recognized as a human form, the flesh so thoroughly blackened and blistered that the features had melted into a grotesque mosaic of muscle, bone, and collapsed tissue. And yet what held my gaze, what rooted me to the spot in a way that made me forget how to breathe, was the mouth, wide open and frozen in a shape that was no longer capable of making sound, but had clearly done so just moments earlier. Even worse, though I still struggled to articulate how, I saw the chest rise. It wasn't a gasp, not the violent heave of someone returning from the edge of death, nor was it the jerky post-mortem twitch of gases escaping from a stiffening corpse. Instead, it was a faint, almost gentle expansion, like the shallow breath of someone in deep sleep, except this man was gone, fully, utterly gone. And there was nothing natural or reflexive about what we were witnessing. Kara stepped back, her mouth forming a soundless exhalation that may have been a prayer or a curse or a silent cry of disbelief. And then, without warning, she turned and fled the room, her footsteps echoing sharply against the tile as she disappeared down the corridor, leaving me alone with the open bag and the awful certainty that I was not imagining what I had just seen. When Dr. Singh arrived less than a minute later, calm and clinical as always, he examined the body with practiced detachment, running through the expected motions, checking the radial pulse, lifting the eyelids, scanning the pupils with his penlight, even pressing on the sternum for any sign of cardiac response, all of which, as expected, yielded nothing. He pronounced again what had already been recorded. Time of death remained unchanged, condition consistent with thermal fatality, no signs of revival, no irregularities that warranted additional examination. And though he did not say anything unusual had occurred, I saw the brief, subtle hesitation in his hands as he zipped the bag closed once more. This time moving a touch slower, as if he were no longer entirely comfortable with how final that gesture truly was. He left us to finish the storage process, and as I reached for the drawer handle and began to slide the gurney into place, a low, creeping tension coiled in my spine, and the moment I let go of the latch, just before it clicked into place, that sound returned, louder, longer, and so disturbingly human that I stumbled back a step, barely able to comprehend how it could have emerged from within the sealed bag when I had just watched the doctor confirm that no life remained. It screamed. There is no other word for it. And what terrified me more than the scream itself was the absolute certainty that the voice had changed, not in pitch or tone, but in something deeper, something spiritual, as if whatever force had cried out the first time had now realized it was trapped, confined, buried alive in darkness. and was using the last ounce of whatever power it had left to plead or rage or beg for release. I slammed the drawer shut with shaking hands and walked out of the room without cleaning up, without logging the last timestamp, and without looking back. Because something deep inside me knew that if I turned around and saw the shape of that face pressing upward against the vinyl, I wouldn't have been able to leave that room ever again. Kara never came back after that night. She handed in her badge before sunrise, refused all contact, and vanished so completely from our rotation that it was as if she'd been transferred to another dimension entirely. And though the whispers on staff ranged from breakdowns to hallucinations to stress-induced trauma, none of the rationalizations ever addressed what was written, by hand not typed, at the bottom of the intake form. Beneath the usual entries and codes and timestamps, in thick, deliberate pen strokes underlined twice in red ink, were the only words that told the truth of what happened that night. Patient declared deceased. Bag vocalized after death. Witnessed by 2 RN staff. No one ever claimed the body. No ID ever surfaced. No obituary ever printed. That bag was never seen again. Some said it was incinerated. Others believed it was quietly disposed of off record. And one of the janitors later told me, in a half-whisper during a night shift months later, that he thought it simply vanished, gone by the next morning like it had never been wheeled in at all. But I know better. I remember the sound it made. I remember the weight of the air in that room. And I remember the unmistakable truth that something inside that body did not want to stay dead. It happened in the early spring of 2006, during one of those long overnight shifts at the hospital where I'd been working for nearly a decade. A mid-sized facility just outside of Boston that handled more than its share of late-night emergencies. By that point in my career, I had grown accustomed to the strange rhythm of the ER. The heavy silence between traumas, the sudden bursts of chaos when a trauma code was called, and the quiet but constant hum of machines, fluorescent lights, and exhausted breathing from patients who couldn't sleep. That night had begun like so many others before it, with a steady trickle of patients that ranged from the typical to the barely worth noting. A teenage boy who had fractured his wrist during a late basketball game at the rec center. A woman who had come in with mild contractions but turned out to be experiencing nothing more than Braxton Hicks. And an elderly gentleman who had waited far too long to come in for signs of a possible stroke. It was just before 3 in the morning when the automatic doors of the ER slid open, and a woman stepped inside with a kind of deliberate stillness that made me lift my eyes from the chart I had been updating. She appeared to be in her early 30s, dressed in simple, slightly damp clothing. An oversized zip-up hoodie drawn tightly around her chest, and faded jeans that clung to her legs like she'd been caught in a downpour. Though the weather outside had been dry for hours, her hair was pulled back into a low ponytail that looked hastily gathered, strands of it clinging to her forehead. And though she wasn't shouting or stumbling or bleeding, something about her posture and the way she moved suggested that she was holding herself together through sheer willpower. Her arms were wrapped tightly across her body, not in the casual way that people sometimes fold their arms while waiting, but in a strained and almost clenched embrace, as if she were trying to protect her core from something invisible and closing in fast. Her expression was far from vacant, but her wide, unfocused eyes kept shifting rapidly across the room, bouncing from the overhead lights to the corners of the walls to the faces of each staff member in the area without ever settling on any one thing for more than a second. She didn't speak at first, and when one of the nurses gently asked what had brought her in, she answered only after a long pause, her voice dry and hoarse, as she explained that she was experiencing a sharp, spreading pain in the center of her chest. Though the way she described it didn't quite match the textbook symptoms of cardiac distress. There was no clutching or gasping, no dramatic collapse or sweating. Instead, she stood with her back braced against the wall just beyond triage, her body trembling slightly as she refused to be guided into one of the exam rooms, stating plainly and without emotion that she needed to remain in the hallway, where she could keep her eyes on the staff and the exits at all times. Despite the concerning nature of her complaint, her vitals, though elevated, were within a manageable range, with her blood pressure running high but not dangerously so, and her pulse remaining consistently fast but regular. She wasn't in visible distress in the traditional sense, but there was a frantic undercurrent to her breathing, a thin, quiet rhythm of inhalation that never seemed to fill her lungs all the way. We performed the usual workup without delay, running an ECG and obtaining chest films, drawing blood for a rapid cardiac panel, and hooking her up to the monitor as quickly as she would allow us to. Every result came back clean. Her heart showed no sign of ischemia. Her chest X-ray revealed no abnormalities. Her troponin levels were well within normal limits, and her oxygen saturation remained steady throughout. On paper, this woman was in no immediate danger, and yet she stood there as if she were on the brink of something irreversible. As the minutes passed, her anxiety became harder to dismiss, not because she acted erratically or raised her voice, but because she continued to behave with a kind of grim, unshakable certainty. The kind you see sometimes in patients who know, without needing medical confirmation, that something is terribly wrong. She didn't exhibit the erratic energy of someone experiencing a manic episode, nor the disorientation that often comes with psychosis or delusion. Instead, she maintained a sharp, reactive presence, and though her body language was tense, her thoughts were clear and direct whenever she did speak. When one of the nurses offered a small dose of Ativan to help reduce her visible panic, she refused it without hesitation, her voice quiet but firm, and instead kept her gaze trained on the ceiling lights above Bay 6, flinching slightly whenever the light nearest to her flickered. I remember clearly the moment she said something that, even now, I can hear in my head without effort. One of our younger orderlies, trying, I think, to offer reassurance, told her that she was safe here, that nothing was going to happen to her in the hospital. The woman didn't smile or thank him. She didn't react with gratitude or even acknowledgement. She simply turned toward him with an exhausted but level stare and said, "It's not me I'm worried about. It's you." She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain. And no one pressed her, though we probably should have. Roughly 35 minutes later, without any kind of escalation or warning, her body gave out in a way that none of us could have anticipated. I had only stepped into the adjacent hallway to check on another patient when I heard the unmistakable sound of a body striking tile. The thud was soft but sickening, and by the time I rushed back toward Bay 6, she was already on the ground. Her body had contorted unnaturally, her back arched with such force that her shoulder blades barely touched the floor, and her hands were frozen in a claw-like spasm, fingers curled in toward her palms as if locked by some inner resistance. The initial assumption was seizure activity, and we immediately initiated a code, bringing in the crash cart and starting CPR as the monitor remained flatlined. We administered epinephrine, attempted defibrillation, opened her airway, and continued compressions in perfect rhythm. But nothing worked. Not a spike in heart rate, not a hint of electrical response, not even a single beat of spontaneous circulation. Her body remained still, and her skin began to pale with an unnatural speed that we all noticed but said nothing about at the time. At 3:52 a.m., she was pronounced dead. The official cause listed was sudden cardiac arrest, unspecified origin. The coroner's report revealed nothing remarkable. No blocked arteries, no hemorrhaging, no signs of trauma, no substances in her bloodstream, and no previously undiagnosed condition that would explain what had happened. Her heart was healthy, her brain was intact, her blood was clean. She had simply died, as though something had decided, without medical reason, that her time had ended. The shift continued, as shifts always do. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the ER after that night. In the days that followed, a quiet tension settled over the staff who had been present during those early morning hours. We didn't speak about it directly, not to new hires or during briefings. But there were sidelong glances and unspoken agreements that something about Bay 6 was off. Within a week, one of the night nurses mentioned that the overhead light above the same bay had begun flickering intermittently, despite repeated maintenance calls and fixture replacements. It wasn't every light in the wing, only that one, and only at night. One of our respiratory techs, a reliable and pragmatic man who had worked with us for years, approached me quietly after a shift and asked if I'd ever heard crying in the hallway near Bay 6 when no patients were present. I thought he was joking until I saw the expression on his face. He told me that while he had been restocking supplies after hours, he had stood alone near the same tile where the woman had collapsed and heard the unmistakable sound of a woman sobbing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but muffled and low, as if someone were curled beneath the floor, trying not to be heard. He said the sound stopped as soon as he moved, and when he stood still again, it began once more. He checked every room. No one was there. I didn't tell him that I had experienced something similar a few nights earlier, when I had paused in the hallway to review a chart and heard what I initially thought was a distant ventilation issue. The sound was soft, rhythmic, and unmistakably human. I stood frozen for a full 30 seconds, trying to locate its source. But the moment I stepped forward, it ceased completely. There was no source. There was no one else around. There was only the silence that came after. And the uneasy feeling that I had stepped across was something I shouldn't have. Eventually, the hallway was used less and less, not because of any formal policy change, but because staff instinctively avoided it. When Bay 6 had to be used, it was filled quickly and emptied faster. People rarely lingered. We never spoke of the woman again, never referred to her by name, if she even had one on record. But those of us who had seen her that night carried her presence with us in a way that never quite left. I still don't know what followed her into that ER. And I won't pretend to understand what she had seen or felt before she came through those doors. But I remember her eyes. I remember how certain she was. And I remember that she hadn't been afraid for herself. She had been afraid for us. And whatever she had tried to keep away by staying in the light, whatever presence she believed had found its way into that hallway, never once pretended to leave. I had worked night shifts in trauma care long enough to know that most nights followed a predictable rhythm. Quiet lulls interrupted by chaos, sometimes violent, sometimes tragic, but rarely mysterious. Over the years, I had learned how to keep my emotions compartmentalized, how to separate my reactions from the demands of the job. Because if you allowed the strangeness or the horror of any one case to sit with you too long, it would find a way to follow you home. But in all the years I worked in emergency medicine, there was only one patient who ever stayed with me, not because of how she came in or how she left, but because I still don't understand what I witnessed that night. It happened in the dead of winter, during a particularly frigid January night in 2008. The roads outside had turned slick with black ice, and the wind cut through your coat no matter how tightly you pulled it around yourself. We were running short-staffed again, with one of our attendings out sick and the trauma ward already at capacity. I remember glancing at the clock, 2:03 a.m., when the paramedics radioed in to announce they were in transit with a female patient who had been pulled from the wreckage of a multi-vehicle collision just off the I-75 exit. They reported she was unresponsive at the scene and had no identification on her person. No purse, no license, not even a phone. Just a blood-soaked jacket and a nearly non-existent pulse. When she arrived, I was already gloved and standing at Bay 2, ready for intake. They wheeled her in on a gurney, her limbs limp beneath the straps, and her face half concealed under dried streaks of blood and grime. Her hair was dark, long, and tangled against her collarbone, and her skin looked waxen under the fluorescent lights, almost as if the warmth had already drained from her completely. The paramedics had intubated her en route and reported she had briefly flatlined in the ambulance before they were able to get her back with a single defibrillation shock. They said she had been alone in the vehicle, which had been totaled from the passenger side inward, leaving no clear indication of how she had survived the impact in the first place. The trauma team moved quickly, as we always did. We placed an emergency line, ordered immediate labs, including a type and a cross-match, and began scanning for internal injuries. Her abdomen was rigid and distended, which suggested she was bleeding internally, and the left side of her chest showed signs of blunt force trauma, possibly broken ribs with organ involvement. We had barely gotten the ultrasound probe to her abdomen before her blood pressure began to tank. She was crashing in real time, and we didn't have the luxury of waiting 45 minutes for the blood bank to process her typing. In critical cases like this, we administered O-negative blood. Universal donor, always on standby, always safe. At least, it had always been safe before. Within a minute of initiating the transfusion, her body began reacting in a way none of us had ever seen. Her chest heaved against the ventilator rhythm, and the tone on the heart monitor shifted into rapid arrhythmia. Her oxygen saturation levels, which had been low but stable, dropped suddenly into the 40s, and her heart rate spiked to over 160 before plummeting just as fast. I saw the flush rise in her neck first, dark, mottled, and unnatural in color. And then her limbs began to stiffen, her fingers curling toward her palms as though she were seizing. Within seconds, her heart stopped entirely. The room erupted into motion again as we began full resuscitation. Compressions started immediately, and the crash cart was wheeled in with epinephrine already drawn. We administered multiple rounds, attempting to reverse the reaction, but nothing we did had the expected effect. Her body temperature rose 2 full degrees in under 90 seconds, and her skin turned a shade I had never seen on a living person, almost purple-black, as if her veins were rejecting the blood we had just put inside her. For a brief moment, I genuinely thought we had lost her for good. Then, just as suddenly as her body had failed, it corrected itself. Her cardiac rhythm returned without another shock. Her breathing stabilized. Her blood pressure climbed back to a livable range. We didn't push anything else. Not more blood, not fluids, not medication. We simply watched as the woman's vitals normalized on their own, like the trauma had peaked and passed, and whatever had gone wrong had reversed itself entirely. Still reeling from what we had just seen, I walked her sample down to the lab myself. The first blood draw, taken just after her arrival, had already been processed and returned a result of AB negative. An uncommon type, but nothing out of the ordinary. Still, something in my gut told me to collect a second sample once she had stabilized. I drew the blood from the same line and sent it down to the same technician, marking it as stat for confirmation. When the second result came back less than an hour later, I could hear the uncertainty in the tech's voice even before he told me what he had found. The second sample typed as O positive. I didn't believe him, so I went back down and requested a manual rerun. We ran both samples side by side under supervision using 2 different analyzers. Same name, same patient ID, same lab tech. 2 completely incompatible results. We checked everything. The accession numbers, the label signatures, the timestamps, and even the storage temperature of the samples. There was no mistake. There had been no contamination, no tube switch, no system error. The blood we had drawn from her when she arrived was AB negative. The blood we drew less than 60 minutes later was O positive. We had no explanation, and neither did the hematology resident who reviewed it with me. Back in the ER, we attempted to document the conflicting results in her chart. But the hospital's electronic record system flagged the input immediately and locked the patient file. The error message read, "Incompatible lab data," and the system refused to save. One of the residents tried to override it using manual input, but the entire record crashed before the changes could be stored. It happened again on the second attempt, and by the third, we stopped trying altogether. We printed the lab results instead, taped them inside the paper chart, and left a handwritten note indicating the technical issues. Later that morning, just before the end of my shift, a young intern who had joined our rotation a few weeks prior made a strange comment while reviewing the patient's intake form. He had been flipping through the pages in silence, but when he came to the low-resolution intake photograph, the one we had taken when she was first admitted, he froze. I saw his brow furrow, and his eyes narrow in a way that told me something had clicked. He told us, carefully, that he recognized the woman. Not from the ER, and not from any previous admission, but from a case study he had seen during a pathology seminar the year before. He said she had been featured in a lecture on unexplained medical anomalies, a case from a hospital in Illinois in 2003. According to the presentation, the woman had arrived after a train derailment, severely injured, and with multiple conflicting blood tests. The details mirrored our case with eerie precision. That woman, too, had suffered a near-fatal reaction to a transfusion, had displayed incompatible blood types, and had vanished from her room without explanation before dawn. What made the intern uneasy, what made all of us pause, was that the woman in that case had been presumed dead 5 years earlier. And yet here she was, the same face, the same birthmark beneath her collarbone, the same impossible pattern of survival and disappearance. I didn't know what to make of it. None of us did. I returned to her room later that evening to check on her myself. Her name still hadn't been entered into the system. Her wristband read only Jane Doe. The monitors had been powered down. Her chart remained untouched on the footboard, but the bed was empty. Assuming she had been moved for imaging or transferred to ICU without the paperwork being updated. I checked with the central desk. No transport orders had been filed. No bed request had been logged. No nurse had escorted her anywhere. She had not been discharged. She had not coded. She had not left with anyone. She had simply vanished. The hallway camera outside her room, which should have recorded every movement, showed nothing. In fact, there was no footage at all. The security archive from 2:07 a.m. to 4:31 a.m. had failed entirely. Every other wing of the hospital retained full, uninterrupted coverage, except the corridor outside the trauma bay, which remained corrupted and unrecoverable. The IT team confirmed there had been no power outage and no server malfunction. It was as if the system had simply stopped recording during the precise window of her presence. Inside her room, everything was intact. Her hospital gown had been folded on the lower edge of the mattress. The IV pole had been knocked to the floor, but showed no signs of a fall or struggle. On the linoleum, just past the doorway threshold, there was a dried pool of blood, small but thick and dark at the edges. I collected the sample myself and sent it for testing. The result that came back the next morning confirmed what we had already suspected. The blood belonged to no known patient. It matched no chart. It was not hers. It was not anyone's. The incident report was filed quietly. The hospital administration classified the case as unresolved and sealed the chart 3 days later. When I attempted to access her file a week after the event, it had been deleted entirely, both digitally and physically. Even the lab reports we had printed and taped into the file were missing. It was as if she had never been admitted at all. But I kept copies. I wasn't supposed to, but I had made duplicates of both blood tests and stored them in a folder at the back of my locker. I still have them, even now. 2 results, side by side. Same name, same ID. 2 different blood types. I've stared at them more times than I can count, hoping that someday I'll find an explanation that makes sense. I've spent more years in trauma medicine than I care to count. And in that time, I've watched the human body in every stage of survival and failure. Lives pulled back from the edge with seconds to spare, and others that slipped away in spite of everything we threw at them. You develop a rhythm in this line of work, a hardened balance between compassion and detachment that lets you function when the stakes are blood-soaked and irreversible. But no amount of training or experience prepared me for what happened in the summer of 2012. Inside a trauma bay that many of us would later refuse to enter alone. Not because of superstition, but because of something far heavier and harder to explain. It was a Wednesday night during a particularly brutal stretch of August heat in El Paso. The kind of night where even the air inside the hospital felt dry and charged, and where patients trickled in mostly with dehydration, heat stroke, and a few non-critical injuries from minor traffic collisions and domestic disputes. Typical calls for that time of year. I was 3 hours into my night shift, restocking trays and preparing one of the trauma bays for a possible incoming when the overhead call came through, confirming the arrival of a Priority 1 trauma case being transported from the outskirts near the old shipping warehouses just past the rail yard. The report was grim from the moment it was called in. A man in his late 30s or early 40s, no known identity at the time, found behind a dilapidated industrial building, having fallen from what EMS estimated to be the 3rd or 4th story onto a wrought iron perimeter fence. One of the ornamental spires had entered cleanly through the upper portion of his chest, likely puncturing the lung and nicking the heart before exiting through his back beneath the shoulder blade. The damage, as described by the paramedics en route, was so extensive that by the time they reached him, he had already lost too much blood to sustain meaningful life. Despite this, and in keeping with protocol, they initiated transport and CPR in the ambulance, though they'd already confirmed no respiration, no pulse, and fully fixed pupils for the entirety of the ride. When the gurney rolled into Trauma Bay 3, the room fell into that sterile calm we all know too well. The one that comes when there's nothing more to do but confirm what's already been decided by the body. His shirt and jacket had been cut away in the ambulance, exposing the massive entry wound still rimmed with rust and blood. And the deep lividity across his arm suggested he'd been dead for longer than we'd been told. His skin was pale and cooling, his mouth slightly open, and the smell of iron, sweat, and sun-baked concrete still clung to him. One of the residents, new to nights, hesitated when stepping closer, and I don't blame him. There was something unusually still about this particular case, something in the room that felt compressed, like the air itself was pressing inward from the corners. The attending physician gave him a quick but thorough assessment. No heart sounds, no respirations, pupils dilated and unreactive to light. And after checking the readouts and confirming the time, he called the official time of death. The staff moved methodically after that, beginning the standard documentation and early post-mortem procedures, while I stood at the tray, organizing tubing and noting what would be required to clear the room for the next rotation. It was then, just minutes into what should have been a quiet conclusion, that the entire dynamic in the room shifted. Without warning and with a suddenness that felt completely unnatural, the man's chest expanded violently as he drew in a ragged, gasping breath that echoed through the room. In a way that didn't sound like the typical reflexive, agonal responses we sometimes see post-mortem. This wasn't the twitch of decaying nerves or a momentary electrical misfire in muscle tissue. This was full, active respiration, accompanied by an abrupt upward movement of his entire upper torso, as if something had yanked him by an invisible string upward from the gurney itself. His eyes shot open, wide and bloodshot, and for several seconds he stared fixedly toward the far wall of the trauma bay with an expression so stricken, so consumed by what looked like pure terror, that I felt myself take an involuntary step backward without even realizing I had done so. The monitor, which only moments before had been displaying a clean, continuous flat line, suddenly sprang to life, showing a regular sinus rhythm, strong oxygen saturation, and vitals that didn't match what we knew to be medically possible given the nature and extent of his wounds. He shouldn't have had circulation, much less a readable blood pressure. But there it was, clear, impossible, undeniable. One of the residents gasped. A nurse standing nearest to the bed dropped her clipboard. No one moved toward him for several seconds, not out of fear necessarily, but because we were all still trying to process whether what we were witnessing could be explained by anything we'd been taught. As he lay there, restrained only loosely by the straps intended to keep his limbs from falling off the sides of the bed, he began to whisper. His voice was weak, strained, and cracked from what I assumed was either dehydration or sheer trauma to his respiratory system. But the words were unmistakable. Over and over, he repeated the same phrase in a voice that shook with fatigue and dread. "Don't let him in. Don't let him follow." He spoke as if relaying something urgent, something that needed to be known by someone, anyone, before whatever was coming had a chance to reach him again. The attending tried to administer sedation and reinitiate an assessment to determine neurological function. But before any steps could be taken to stabilize him further, the lights above us flickered in rapid succession, not in the sharp blink of a blown circuit, but in a strange, rhythmic dimming that moved down the hallway and into the trauma bay itself. The fluorescent bulbs above Bay 3 pulsed, one of them cracking loudly and briefly sparking before going completely dark, leaving a harsh shadow draped across half the room. Everyone froze again. The silence this time wasn't clinical, it was suffocating. Just as suddenly as before, the patient's vitals plummeted, the line on the monitor flattening with a shrill, unbroken tone. He didn't convulse, didn't exhale. He simply stopped. As if whatever force had kept him clinging to this side of the veil had been forcibly removed or simply yanked back to where it had come from. One of the more experienced trauma nurses, someone I'd worked with for over 7 years on the night shift, backed out of the room without a word, her face pale and damp with sweat. Later, she told me, with visible discomfort, and a voice that trembled in a way I'd never heard from her before, that she had seen something in the far corner of the trauma bay just before the lights flickered. She couldn't describe it in detail, only that it had shape, height, and presence, and that it had felt like it was watching all of us. The second time of death was called, and though the official paperwork treated it as a simple cardiac arrest secondary to traumatic injury, every person in that room knew it wasn't the full story. Security was asked to review the tapes the following morning as part of a routine incident review due to the power fluctuations. But what they found on the internal camera feed from Bay 3 was far from routine. 7 seconds after the time of death had been documented, with the man's body now firmly restrained to prevent post-mortem movement, he moved again. His upper torso arched off the gurney in a motion that wasn't subtle or gradual, but violent and immediate, as if something had pulled him upward against the weight of gravity and death itself. His mouth fell open, his head tilted back unnaturally far, and his eyes, which had remained wide even in death, were fixed directly on the overhead camera. Then, just as quickly, he collapsed back into the bed. And this time, he didn't move again. The footage was viewed once by senior staff and hospital administration, then quietly removed from the system without further explanation. None of us were ever asked for written statements. No report of the event's anomalies was filed. Officially, the man died of cardiac trauma from a fall. Unofficially, none of us believed that was the whole truth. In the years that followed, Trauma Bay 3 slowly earned the nickname The Doorway, a title whispered between night shift staff and passed along in half-joking, half-serious warnings to new interns who asked why no one volunteered to treat overflow cases there after midnight. It became a place people avoided for reasons they couldn't name. And though the paint was redone and the overheads replaced, the feeling inside that room never changed. I don't know who that man was or what he encountered before he came back to us that first time, but I believe, truly, quietly, and deeply, that something followed him, something crossed with him, if only briefly. And I don't believe it ever fully left. That room doesn't feel empty anymore. It hasn't since that night. And now, even all these years later, when I pass Bay 3 during a late shift especially when the halls are quiet and the air feels heavier than usual. I make a point not to glance toward the far corner, because I'm not sure I could stand the feeling of seeing something stare back.